So Gustav Breuer or Brauer or Brewer?
It's hard to know how he pronounced his name. He was born in Bavaria, moved to Portland in the 1800s, and his name is Breuer. If I was in Bavaria and I met someone with that name, I would pronounce it Breuer.
Okay.
But since he lived in Portland, he may have anglicized it, and he may have been known as Brewer.
Brewer. And maybe we'll stick with Brewer. It's easier to say. Somehow Breuer doesn't quite roll off the tongue.
That's
we're not Bavarian enough. Yeah. All right, so what happened to poor Gus?
Okay, so Gus was a saloon tender. A bartender. He had the City View Saloon, which was down at the corner of Union and Clay.
And Union is today
Martin Luther King. Good point.
Mm-hmm.
Above the saloon was the City View Hotel.
Okay.
On September 15th, 1904, he was shot to death in his saloon.
Mm-hmm.
He was getting ready to clean up. They said that he had been cleaning spittoons in the backyard where the restroom was, and stepped back into the door and was shot 5 times. Was it 5?
I think so.
Yeah. 5 Italians were in the saloon playing cards at the time. They pointed at a suspect right away, said he shot him from outside the building.
He wasn't present at the time. His name was Robert Lewis. He was a carpenter living in the lodging house at the corner, and he was promptly arrested, right? And the 5 Italians all said that he was the one who had come in there and shot him, that he had been there about 10 minutes before the shooting happened, asking for a drink, and Brewer said, "No, sorry buddy, you're too drunk already." He went to the back door and confronted Brewer while he was cleaning the spittoons and shot him dead. But there were conflicting versions of that story. Some of them had him coming around from the back and shooting him toward the inside. Another version from a different witness, that is the 5 Italians, said he was shot from the inside out into the backyard. So there were kind of conflicting versions, but Lewis was arrested, taken in, said he was a friend of Brewer's, right?
Well, when he sobered up, he didn't make much sense as a suspect anymore, because he did know Brewer. He had said he had credit with him. You know, a lot of things didn't add up, and a lot of suspicion started falling on these Italians who were there.
But real quick, before we get to more about the Italians, I do like this detail that Lewis, quote, used to be a habitual hanger-on at the Lion Saloon at the corner of 4th and Flanders, and that he was a close companion of the notorious Lizzie Kleinsmith. Now, we don't know who Lizzie Kleinsmith was, but she sounds really awesome.
And the Oregonian liked to call people notorious at this time and then not tell us who they were.
Yeah. So if anyone knows or has friends who know Lizzie Kleinsmith,
we'd like to know.
Sounds pretty cool. Yeah.
But these Italians, and their names are difficult because they're spelled differently in every story. And when I search the Oregonian archives, I can be looking at an article with their name in it, search that name, and not even find the article I'm looking for. So they're not, it's really hard to find information on these guys. But they did act very suspiciously. Joe Day, our famous homicide detective, the most famous homicide detective in Portland at that time and for many, many years afterwards, was not very competent in the way he handled this case.
Yeah, what did he do? He didn't really question the 5 Italians, right? They weren't really searched. He didn't search them, which...
Didn't take them in. He basically said, okay, we'll go arrest the guy you said it was, see you later. But then it came out that immediately after the shooting, one of the Italian guys ran out of the saloon and hid a gun in the bushes.
But it turned out to be a different caliber,
so it wasn't a murder weapon. But it's kind of suspicious. And the next day they did pick them up as suspects and put them in jail, and they ended up in jail for several weeks.
And at that point, Joe Day was taken off the case, right? He was replaced with another detective for basically being considered kind of incompetent. On not searching these 5 Italians, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There's a headline in September 26, 1904, headline in Oregonian says, "It leads to Italians." And basically it gives this really detailed account of how the property adjoining the City View Hotel, in which Brewer's Saloon was located, was owned by a, quote, Italian company composed of workmen who have invested their savings in this real estate. And so it describes how basically there have been attempts to acquire the City View Hotel and the Saloon to create a large warehouse on 2 adjacent properties. But basically our man Brewer stood in the way. He turned down several repeated efforts to try to end his lease early. And so it describes how there were several different what is called committees of these Italian business people trying to negotiate with Breuer, and each time he turned them down. So on the night of the murder, it now says on September 26th that those 5 Italians were actually the new committee that was represented to come in and try to convince Breuer to end his lease early. So that sounds pretty interesting.
And at least 2 of them had been involved in trying to get him to end that lease before.
And it should also be noted that very day before, in the want ads in the Oregonian, and this is the kind of thing that you can find out because of the digital archives, the City View Saloon was listed for sale, quote, on account of the death of the proprietor. So the timing is pretty interesting, on that,
This block right here, I think, is the main action of the Gus Breuer story. The hotel and the saloon were probably in that corner at the end of the block, and then the boarding house that Lewis lived in would have been either next door to it or across the street.
But you were saying that because of the Hawthorne Bridge right here, this would have been a very bustling part of town, right?
Because the bridge was here, the approach wasn't, but the bridge was here. It was one of the major crossings, so this is like the heart of East Portland, the south end of East Portland. But it would have been quite busy here. And so when the Italian ran out of the saloon after the shooting and hid his gun in the bushes, he probably ran down this block and did it.
Right over here.
Yeah. So let's walk along and see if we can find a handgun in the bushes.
Yeah. See if there's any remnant. Certainly nothing in terms of architecture to see.
Yeah, as far as I can see, I'm looking in both directions. I don't see a single structure that was here in 1904.
Nope.
This is all new stuff.
All new.
John Smith.
Then the sheriff's department got involved in the case, and they arrested a guy named John Smith. And I don't remember the details of why they suspected him.
It's a little complicated. It says that he was said to have made threats. Smith called Breuer a, quote, foul name at his saloon and said, "Wait and see what I do with that man." So that was kind of suspicious. And then it's a little bit weird kind of domestic thing that an unnamed friend of Smith's told Smith's wife right away that Smith was the murderer, but kept it secret, fearing notoriety until 3 weeks ago, which is sort of weird. And basically that the idea was that Smith had killed Breuer after efforts to secure a divorce from Mrs. Smith. So
it's interesting.
Yeah, and Smith himself blamed his son's recent death. His son had died on Breuer for, quote, not having a mother's care. So he said that because basically Breuer had played a role in encouraging this divorce, that then this guy Smith's son had died because he didn't have a mother anymore to be there for him.
See, it's when we start talking about things like this, there are so many echoes of the Van Dran case from the next year.
Yeah,
it's weird.
Yeah, there's weird family sort of stuff. There's the property, saloons and property. But basically, they come back on October 16th again to a story about the Italians, and it says basically that one of the 5 Italians did do it, but the name cannot yet be divulged.
Right, but when they arrested Smith, they released all the Italians.
Yeah, they released all the Italians, right? So then suddenly it shifted, and this happens a lot in these early cases. That sort of like back and forth. One day it's, we definitely know who it is, and here it is, and then the next day it's like, oh, no, never mind, it wasn't them. But then it says that the catch now was that it was one of the 5 Italians. They couldn't say who yet, but that it was not premeditated at all, that it was an accident, and that basically a big fight had broken out among these Italians over the card game, and poor Brewer's just cleaning the spittoons over there by the door, and he just takes 5 bullets in the fray accidentally because he's just standing too close.
There's another weird bullet in the case. Now he was killed with a 38. Is that
38? Right. Yeah.
And the pistol that was hidden was a 32, so that wasn't a murder weapon. But then they found a 38 bullet, a spent bullet, just laying on the floor under the bar. And the theory was that it was planted there to make it look like the shooting had happened from the outside. But
when the way the body fell,
the
other bullets.
And bullets in the outhouse outside, the shooting obviously came from inside the saloon.
So that fit with the idea that these guys were claiming that Lewis, remember that we already had so many suspects here, but Robert Lewis, the first guy, was basically coming in and shooting them up.
Okay. Well, this is the grave of Gustav J. Breuer, 1857 to 1904, shot 5 times in the doorway of his saloon. It's interesting because they had suspects right away. They arrested a guy like the first night. said, he's the killer. No, it wasn't him. Arrested the five Italians. They're the killer. No, it wasn't them. Arrested another guy. He's the killer. No, it wasn't him. And this is kind of the normal way that it went. And something you pointed out, JB, was that people couldn't easily go back and check that. So if they saw it in the paper, that was the story. And they couldn't, unless they saved the paper, they didn't have a way to get online and check the archive and see what had been said before. So your memory can play tricks on you.
The paper was really ephemeral at that point.
Exactly.
Most people weren't saving it.
Exactly. And the other thing, and the Police Bureau came under intense criticism during this case and for a couple of years afterward for not solving murders. We had a new detective department. It was a new idea in policing was to have detectives, and there were 5 or 6 of them in Portland at the time. They didn't really have any tools to solve crimes. There was kind of a belief that a detective solved a murder with his guts. And the real technique they used was to grab a suspicious person, try and get them to confess. And that's how they solved most of the murders. But that doesn't solve murders.
So this is before fingerprinting, really?
There was fingerprinting. In fact, I think the first use of fingerprints in a murder case was right around this time.
Okay.
But that was in Argentina. And it wasn't in the United States. And even in the 20s, when we were using fingerprints on a regular basis, most of the old cops thought, oh, that's just scientific garbage. That's not police work.
It wasn't really standardized.
Right. At this time, they had a thing called the Bertillon method, which was a way of identifying someone by measuring a whole bunch of their body parts. And if you had a full set of measurements on the person, nobody else supposedly would have those same exact measurements. And it was a pretty good way to identify people, kind of cumbersome. But even that was considered to be kind of a fancy schmancy. That wasn't police work. Police work was follow your gut, grab somebody you suspect, and get a confession. And that led to brutal methods. That led to convicting innocent people.
And it would be a sloppy kind of process throughout, right? That even in crime scenes, you'd have the public not necessarily kept out of
Absolutely.
it. Public getting involved in moving things around, getting their fingerprints on stuff.
There are some cases where deputies actually sold tickets and let people walk through a murder site, and evidence was stolen. There's at least 2 cases I know of where that happened.
And we can see in the Breuer case, certainly with the bullets turning up in various places, probably not being paid attention to in the careful way that modern ballistics technology works.
There's no chain of evidence in any of these things. It's like they didn't even have the idea of the chain of evidence at this time. So you never knew. A spent bullet shows up in the bar 3 days later. Was it there on that night and we just missed it? Did somebody bring it? There's no way to tell. The Italians, they arrested the 5 Italians. One of them had a gun. Wasn't the right caliber, so it probably wasn't a murder weapon. Did any of the others have guns? We don't know because they didn't even search those guys the night of the murder.
Did you ever come across any kind of public scrutiny of that in this era or in close eras where people were basically voicing their frustrations about the idea that if it wasn't for sloppy procedure, we'd probably get the guy? Or was
the Oregonian had a lot to say about that. 1904, 1905, the Oregonian pounded the Portland Police Bureau on their inability to solve murders, and you see a lot of angry editorials. I'm positive that it was a big influence on the mayor race that year when Harry Lane was elected, who was a progressive mayor who was bringing more scientific ideas to the city. So yeah, I think there was a lot of that feeling. And, we see some major upgrades of the police department in the next generation, too. By the 20s, Portland had a pretty modern police bureau, even using radio before any of the rest of the country. By the 30s, we were hiring college graduates, and we had a professional police force. It takes a long time for these things to change, but generationally it does.